Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of Laurel Gardens. Episode 2 means that we are officially a series, so that's very exciting. Last time we were together for episode 1, we took a look at this area over here that Masked Bandit had worked on for me. You can see all of the wonderful forest foliage that he put in there, and then the aero coaster just peeking up above the buildings over there. This time, we are going to head in the opposite direction. I'm going to take you guys on a brief little tour here of how we're going to get to our new area that we're taking a look at for this episode. So, right now, we're sort of in the center of the park, and not to give away too much, but you can see that there's a lot of things that are already in place, but very much work in progress. This is going to be a little river walk area here, or I shouldn't say little, it's going to be a fairly extensive area, I suppose, with lots of foliage and different garden areas along the riverside, hopefully with a nice riverboat excursion, something probably meant more to be scenic than as a transport ride or something like that. As we come along here, we're going to pass by our aero hypercoaster that we still have a lot of work to do on. And then what we're going to take a look at here for episode 2 is this inverted coaster. Now, I did not create this inverted coaster. This was created for me by Kinderly in exchange for a carousel cover, of course, for him, for his park. And so he had created this for me as a coaster, an inverted coaster that was built in the year 2000. And the name for this coaster is going to be X2K, which is sort of a play on Y2K, and also the fact that everything in the 90s was, if you wanted it to be extreme or cool, you just put an X in it or in front of it. So that's what we did, and I came up with X2K. We're going to work on fleshing out at least part of this area during this episode. It doesn't get completed totally, but we make some good progress here. And just to give you guys a little background before we get into the updates, the basic idea here is that this path would turn down this way and head back towards the older part of the park. And before this coaster would have been built, this essentially would have been all nature and basically undeveloped, perhaps with the exception of part of the train, which I plan on looping around the back of this coaster eventually. So this will all have been completely new development whenever this coaster was installed in the year 2000. So let's take a look at our first update. One of the first things I wanted to work on for this area actually was the pedestrian bridge that crosses over the river. It's not necessarily part of the area proper, but nonetheless it's an important part of the park infrastructure because it sort of completes the loop that connects the older portion of the park to the newer portion that we started in at the beginning of the video. So I took a lot of inspiration from some bridges in Pittsburgh, namely the West End Bridge, the Fort Duquesne, and the Fort Pitt bridges, that are all these nice arched, I guess you would call them like through arch or through truss bridges. And obviously this is a scaled version of that. It's definitely not full scale. You can see that we really only had enough height to get cross beams at the very, very center. I would say it's probably 12 or so feet at that point, maybe a little bit higher, I'm not exactly sure. But I thought it came out really, really nice, and the fact that it is fairly low means that it actually looks bigger than what it really is. But I think it gives kind of a neat effect. It's not necessarily dominating the skyline because it's not very tall. So it's not something that you're going to see from a lot of different areas in the park, but I think it really does a nice job of creating an interesting way to cross over the river and something that's unique. It's not just your run-of-the-mill I-beams and minimal construction cost kind of bridge. It's something that's a little bit eye-catching and interesting. So while we are over here, and before we get into too much other detail, let's just take a quick, closer look at this coaster. We've got a nice swooping dive here, vertical loop, Immelman, and then we cut back around here through the loop, which I think is an awesome moment there. 0G roll, and then we helix up into a mid-course brake run. We dive back down along the river side here. Corkscrew, or flat spin, or B&M I guess. And then a nice, powerful helix to finish it off. And into the brakes. And you guys will notice here, at some point, I don't know which update it's going to happen, but this section actually changes a little bit. Kinderly and I spoke after I had started to work on the area that because this is a shorter layout and it only runs 2 trains, the mid-course brake run actually isn't necessary. And without it, it seemed like it would have been a stronger layout because you can keep the pacing up a little more. It doesn't break up the ride quite so much. So you'll see at some point this actually goes away and turns into just sort of a drawn-out transition, which I think actually really works for the ride. Gives the riders just a little bit of a breather before this finale, this swoop, flat spin, helix finale. But very much a early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s kind of layout. Still has the pre-drop there and is pretty much just a G-Fest, I would say. But overall, a really, really strong layout. And let's go ahead and check out what we start to do with this area in here. In this update, we have started to build out the path and lay out the plaza for our inverted coaster here. And one of the things that I wanted to do before I got too far into the build was to nail down a logo for the coaster, because that's going to kind of drive our style into a certain direction. So we wanted to get that down so that we had something to work with. And so you'll see here 3 different options that I was working with, and the font is pretty much the same I think across all 3, but it was the background that I was trying to nail down. You'll see that each of them is sort of similar in the way that they're built. They're all very angular and pointy. It's very typical, I think, of something built in the new Millennium to be flashy and extreme looking and kind of in your face. So that's what we were going for. And I ended up sticking with this shape on the left. And so you'll see that as we move along this path here, that sort of forms the entrance to the plaza. Now this isn't in its final form. There are still some things that are going to change about this. So if you're not super crazy about it, just hang tight and reserve judgment. But I wanted to take advantage of this awesome moment here with the 0G roll going right over top of the path to form sort of the gateway into this plaza area. So let's go ahead in. And you'll see as part of this plaza we've got the Gyrodrop tower, and I know that this is a fairly large model in Planko, and I think a lot of people have complained that it is perhaps too large, and I don't necessarily disagree, but at the same time I measured this one to be about 325 feet, and that's really not that far off of the Gyrodrop towers at Kings Island and Kings Dominion, which are both over 300 feet. So it, to me, was not that unrealistic to use it. It is large, but in the grand scheme of things, I think it's pretty far away from the main part of the park, and so hopefully it's not going to be too awkward looking in the skyline. But it works in here because it fits the era. It probably would have been a slightly later addition, perhaps by 2 or 3 years. I think the drop tower built in King's Dominion was 2003, if I'm correct. So if the coaster was built in 2000, then maybe they renovated this part of the plaza to add it in the year 2002, 2003, 2004, somewhere in that general time frame. But what I've also begun to do here is to figure out what the rest of this plaza is going to look like, what its final shape is going to be. And I've got a possible location for maybe a small gift shop or a photo booth where you would stop after leaving the ride, after you go through the exit, to look at your photo and spend some extra money, because that's what parks do. Anytime they can get you to spend money, they're going to. And then I'm going to have my entrance go right between this fence here and this support, so that this area is still open for people to stand and watch as the coaster comes flying right at you and then goes up into that Immelman. And then the entrance is going to snake around here. I am, for now, going to plan to have this fast lane. I haven't decided on a name for it, so we'll just stick with fast lane for now. But we are going to try to integrate this fast lane queue as a separate path there. And then we've got some switchbacks planned to go underneath of the lift. As I had mentioned, there was a little bit more that I wanted to do with the sign, so you'll see that this is more or less in its final state here. There are some details I'm going to add later that are on the ground, but the sign itself is more or less complete. So I've added this gridded texture back behind the lettering, and I also changed the color on this part of the X because it blended in a little bit too much before. It didn't pop the way I wanted it to, so it really just looked like Y2K without the X part, which the Y2K was intentional. I wanted you to see a Y and an X, but before you really just saw a Y, there was no X. So I made that red, it popped, and it also ends up giving me an extra color to use in the rest of the build that we're going to do later on. So we come past there and we come back to our drop tower. This is more or less complete now. We've got a interesting looking sign. I'm not sure that I'm 100% satisfied with it, but it gets the job done. There were a couple names that I was throwing around. The other one that I really liked was something like Terminal Velocity, but I couldn't think of a sign to go with that. So I ended up going with Meteor, which I don't think there's any other drop ride called that, so it seemed original. And I had some idea of a sign that I could do with some of the shapes that are included in the game. So I think it came out well enough. Got some nice foliage here. Remember that this is Laurel Gardens, so we do need to make sure that we got some nice foliage throughout the park. It was a little bit tricky here to do a queue because of the way that the ride actually sits up a little bit. This whole thing is very uneven in terrain. It just continues to sort of slope up towards the ride. So that was a little bit frustrating, but what I ended up doing was basically wrapping one queue path around the outside of the ride pad, and then these inside two lanes here are fake. That's all just windows as walls. It's those castle windows that are snaked around the outside there to create what would be overflow queue. And to be honest, I would imagine on a busy day those would be in use a lot, but on a lighter day they would probably rope them off and just use the outer lane as this ride has pretty good capacity. One of the other details I added that I really liked, you'll notice on a lot of drop towers that they've got these bins, particularly because people don't seem to like to wear their shoes on drop towers. They're always afraid they're going to fall off. And I can understand that if you're wearing sandals or something like that, but I added a couple of these bins around and just used the color scheme of the ride to help them fit in a little bit. So there you go. The next thing that I wanted to work on was the station building itself. I wanted to get that nailed down so that I could start to build in the area that was around it. And it took me quite a few iterations to get to a point where I was happy. I really wanted this angular look to come through, and actually the first thing that I had done was this curved roof here, and I'll put a picture of what that looks like so you guys have an idea in a better context. But the roof itself came out actually really nice, except it did not accomplish the look that I was going for, which was this angular look. So the next thing I went to was this, which I had done a couple versions of. At one point these lines continued here and came to points over here as well. And it has this layered look, which was neat, but it just wasn't jiving. And then I really started going crazy with some ideas here that were just a little bit too far out. And finally, I settled with this. Now, it still has that layered look, even though it's not technically layered with the glass in there. It does have that layered sort of look to it. And I think structurally it makes sense. It's not overly complicated, but it's not a vanilla metal roof either with no interest at all. So it has what I would like for it to have as far as, you know, overall vibe, I guess you would say. And then this gigantic X on the side of the station, I just felt like that was something that they would do in the year 2000 to sell the idea of this coaster being extreme and intense. The other thing that I like about this window here is that when you're in the station waiting in line, it does give you just a little bit more of a view than you would otherwise normally get, because you have that part of the roof that isn't obstructing your view of the coaster anymore. So it doesn't add a ton of view, but you do get some peaks of the coaster here that you wouldn't otherwise get. So very happy with how that came out. And you guys will see here that we need to then carry that general vibe over into this little building that we have here. You'll see that I was toying with the idea of putting the X in front of this Immelman as well, but decided against that. It was kind of a vote over Bro Nation, and people seem to be in favor of keeping it over here on the station. And in the end, I think I agree. This obstructs the view, I think, just a little bit too much. So the other thing I wanted to show you before we head to the next update is that along with the stairs that come off of the exit, of course, we need to have an accessibility ramp. So I've started to rough in an accessibility ramp that goes back behind this building and comes out over here. So we'll see the progress on our next update. This is starting to look like a proper plaza area. We've got a couple different things to look at here. So we will start on the right side. We've got a nice little gateway here that's going to be for our queue, the entrance to our queue. And you guys know that there are some rather large concrete bollards that normally create that gateway in Planet Coaster, so I've conveniently covered those up. I don't necessarily do that for every single ride, but when I have the opportunity to, I like to. So this seemed like a fitting way to open up this ride. It continues to add to that slightly overdone look, and you know, a park trying to make it look extreme and intense. So we're going to keep with that theme, and you'll see that this X on the side of the station is right there in your line of sight whenever you enter. Is a way to get that vibe going as you're entering the queue. Moving on to the left here, we've got railings and supports for our exit stairs. We've got some gates that you can just push open. They would probably be spring-loaded so that whenever you walk through them, they spring back and close themselves. So you got a couple gates there on the exit path, and then we've carried this red line all the way around along the outside of this, and some simple supports underneath of there just to make it feel like it's realistic. And then that is carried through to our ADA accessibility ramp here that goes back behind this building, between the building and the brake run that leads down there. So that's not quite done yet, but I figured I would build that in a little bit while I was working on the railings. And then the last thing to show off in this update here is our photo booth. Now, I had originally had this photo booth with a counter that was basically right up against this wall, and the problem was that any guest that was walking out of this gate was basically going to run right into any other guests that were either standing there looking at the photos that were on the screens or at the cash register making a purchase. So that didn't really work. So instead I centered this up, and then I opened up the inside a little bit here and added essentially a souvenirs window here. Not a full-blown souvenir stall, but enough space that they could have some dedicated merchandise for the ride. And I started to plop a couple things down here. I think I'm going to go on to the workshop, see if there are any other TMTK items that I can plop down. But right now we've got some souvenir cups, mugs, t-shirts, all popular items. And then we've got screens back here for the on-ride photos that they would be showing. You've got a screen up here where the cashier can show whoever is making a purchase what their final photo is going to look like. And then some storage areas back here, and a vent. Maybe they've got some computer some computer stuff in there that they need to keep ventilated. And so that is our photo booth, and I think next update is going to be our last one. So let's go ahead and check that out. Alright, this is the final update for episode 2 of Laurel Gardens here, and I recognize that this is very much incomplete right now. Most of the plaza itself is actually done. There's some detail work that needs to be finished, some curbing, and I need to put lights in and whatnot, but the coaster itself still needs a lot of work. We need to put in some barriers, some fencing. We need to do a little bit of terrain work. We need to definitely do some foliage, but it's to a point where I'm ready to move on to another area of the park and come back to this at a later date just to keep things fresh. So we're going to start with our sign here. The sign itself hasn't changed, but I added this nice detail in front of it. I wanted to keep this nice and open so that it first and foremost didn't block the sign while you were in front of it, but also because whenever you are looking from the bridge, you can actually see the sign pretty well. So I wanted to make sure that this was open and unblocked to keep that sight line as much as possible. And I'll put a picture of that real quick so you guys can see what that looks like from the bridge. A little bit more foliage work here on the right side. As we make our way in, you can see that I've started to put some trash cans down as well. Very important part of the park infrastructure. And then one of my favorite parts of this plaza right here is this seating area that I've put in the middle. I know that it takes up a decent amount of space in the plaza, but considering that these are the only 2 rides that are back here, there's no food stalls or bathrooms or anything, I don't think there needs to be much more space back here than what there is. There's certainly enough room for traffic to flow around here where necessary. But this does a couple things for you. One, it gives a nice big seating area, and since I can't put benches on slopes, it's difficult to put benches anywhere else around here. I was able to fit one in over here, but there are a couple of benches actually sunk in underneath of this, so peeps should come and sit on this whenever I open the park. But it's one of those benches that you probably wouldn't want to sit on for very long. It doesn't look particularly comfortable. However, it serves its purpose, and again, it fits very much into the era of the coaster. I've got this really nice shady tree that goes in the middle here. Conveniently does not block sight lines too much of the photo booth and the station building, so definitely happy with that. And you can see that I've put in some other foliage back here as well, just trying to fill things in and get that vibe going of the area that the park is supposed to be in. And then you'll see here that I've edged this a little bit with some foliage. Very simple evergreens. These are actually just trees that have been sunk in so that you can only see the tops of them. But it gives a really nice clean look and doesn't detract from the real view that you come for, which is the coaster coming straight at you there. And then if we head over to the queue here, you'll see that I've done a little bit of detailing here. I've added some railings. I've added this fast lane gate, and this person is always here because that's what Planko does. But in this particular case, this actually serves as the employee that would be checking fast lane passes and letting people through. So that actually worked out pretty well. Now the actual priority queue doesn't start until way down here, but I don't have a good way right now of covering up these gigantic green arrows, so I didn't want them front and center, and I'm hoping that they'll kind of just fade into the background eventually. Really enjoyed how this came out. Simple evergreens, again, following what I had done in front of the Immelman over here. And then I put rock up underneath of the structure here. Since I don't think that they would want to do mulch everywhere because there's nothing planted back here, and they wouldn't have to refresh this rock every single year the way that you would for mulch. So it creates a really nice contrast. It has a really finished look, I think, rather than just leaving that as like ground texture. And it seems like something parks would do, so I like it. On this side here, the foliage is much more natural. I would imagine even these would probably be wildflowers of some sort, but perhaps the park has let this grow in a little bit just to give it that grown-in feel. And of course, under the coaster itself, they would keep this clear. In fact, I'm considering doing concrete or gravel, at least in the parts of the coaster where you would want to keep them closed off for danger of someone being hit if they were to be in the restricted area at the wrong time. So I may go ahead and put gravel in there, or I may just leave it as plain grass. Something very simple for them to take care of. That would be the goal. And I believe that is it. So we will zoom out here just to get an overview of everything that we've done so far. Which doesn't look like that much in the grand scheme of things, but a lot of detail work has gone into creating it. So we've got our drop ride here, our sign, our station, and our photo building, and then all of the foliage and scenery details that go with it. So I think we're probably going to wrap up with a POV video. I'm sure that's what a lot of people have been waiting for. And I just wanted to say thank you for joining me here in my park, Laurel Gardens. Please consider throwing a comment down below. Let me know what you like, maybe some ideas that you might have for the park. And I will see you guys in episode 3.